Hi, everyone. My name is Audrey. I'm a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Victoria, and I'm one of the co-leads of the FishSounds effort. I have been your host for the seminar series, but for today, I am also the speaker, and I'll be talking about the use of passive acoustic monitoring for fisheries management. Before we get started, please note that this seminar is being recorded to be put on the FishSounds YouTube channel, so hi, YouTube. This will be the last seminar of the series, but you can find all our previous seminars on that same YouTube channel. There should also be time for questions at the end. So for my talk today, I'll provide some quick background information about passive acoustic monitoring, including some terms and an example. I'll then use a gap analysis framework to discuss where we're at, where we could be, and steps to bridge that gap as it relates to Canadian fisheries. I'll then highlight a few next steps if any of you are interested in using passive acoustics for fisheries monitoring or any other applications of interest. So let's get started. As we've heard in several other talks in this seminar series, many fish species can produce what I'll refer to as active sounds intentionally for the purposes of communication. There are also passive sounds that are produced incidentally as the result of other activities like splashing or chewing, but that may still serve some signal functions. These sounds can be recorded, described, and analyzed using a technique called passive acoustic monitoring or passive acoustics. There are many advantages to using passive acoustics as it's non-invasive and can be deployed in remote locations for long periods of time or moved around to get snapshots with high spatial coverage. It can cover other sounds and therefore information beyond a particular target, and the data can be saved and revisited later. However, it does require that your species of interest make sound, and because such behaviors can be species-specific, it can require species-specific knowledge to evaluate its effectiveness and apply it. A bit of foreshadowing for some topics I'll get more into later. But first, to give you an idea of how passive acoustic monitoring works, I'm going to use Gulf toadfish as an example. These slimy, grumpy cuties are highly abundant in coastal habitats like seagrass meadows and rocky shorelines in the southeastern US. Despite the focus of the talk, they are not really a fisheries species, partly because of the sliminess I just mentioned, but I hope you'll indulge me talking about them for a couple of minutes, as I think they can offer an example of one of the most ideal cases for passive acoustic monitoring of a fish species. And this is because Gulf toadfish are great singers. Male Gulf toadfish produce some of the most complex calls among fishes, made up of one or multiple grunts, followed by one or multiple hoots. So here's what they sound like. Might have been a little garbled, at least on my end, but as a quick rendition, it goes boop, boop, boop. So males make their calls all day, every day during their reproductive season while they're trying to attract females or guard their nests. Because of this, their calls can provide an indication of distribution, sex of the caller, and reproductive behaviors. With some speculation, their calls could even provide abundance and size information as well. But how effective is listening to their calls? Well, in my experience, quite effective. I recorded them for several years in Florida and was able to use their sounds to map their distributions around seagrass meadows. Using their calls, I found that Gulf toadfish males seem to prefer nesting around certain types of seagrasses, and I could also pinpoint the start and end of their calling season, and therefore their reproduction season for this region. I also compared how effective my recordings were at detecting Gulf toadfish compared to the more traditional sampling technique of trawling with a net. I was able to detect Gulf toadfish calls at 37 of my 45 sampling events in seagrass meadows, compared to only 5 where we caught toadfish in the trawl. So this demonstrates the effectiveness of passive acoustics as a sampling technique directly. Passive acoustics could also be done by a single person with recordings as short as 5 minutes, compared to the 4 people needed for trawling and the about 10 to 30 minutes needed to trawl and then process the catch. So passive acoustic monitoring of Gulf toadfish calls provided valuable distribution and behavioral information, and it performed better than trawling at detecting toadfish distributions. Take a sip of my tea. So with that background and example in mind, we're going to focus in on Canada's fisheries as a regional example of the current state, demonstrated potential, and steps for advancing passive acoustics to monitor fisheries species. Our FishSounds research group was funded by Fisheries and Oceans Canada to figure out whether, when, and how passive acoustics can inform fisheries management. While there have been so many discussions of the potential of passive acoustics, it still hasn't been widely implemented to monitor fishes. I've also personally encountered a lot of uncertainty from non-bioacousticians as to how helpful it would be and in what ways. So we approached this topic with a gap analysis framework. We summarized the current state of knowledge about soniferous or sound-producing fish species in Canada. We evaluated quantitatively and qualitatively the ability of passive acoustics to provide fisheries-relevant information. And we identified some possible steps that would help bridge the gap between the current limited use of passive acoustics toward the tool achieving its full and realistic potential. While we only focused on Canada's fisheries for this work, we hope the broader conclusions could still be relevant for facilitating passive acoustic monitoring applications in other regions. So to try to get information to feed into our gap analysis framework, we wanted to figure out what we know about soniferous fish species in Canada and the potential for passive acoustics to monitor them. And in this context, I use the term soniferous to mean known to produce active sounds for communication. So a wonderful research assistant, Kayla, first worked to create a list of soniferous fish species. She used FishBase to identify all fish species present in Canada. She then used the FishSounds dataset to find which of these had been shown to make active sounds. She then needed to figure out which of these were fished. This ended up being incredibly difficult, as it turns out there's no comprehensive list of managed fisheries species or species that are regularly fished in Canada. So Kayla ended up spending months poring through decades worth of fisheries notices, looking through other management records she could find online, and contacting over a dozen fisheries managers to try to see if any of our Canadian soniferous species were mentioned in these documents. Though even with all her work, we likely still weren't able to capture everything. We nonetheless took this final list of soniferous fish species, and we used FishBase to get their species characteristics like taxonomy. We then used FishSounds to figure out what publications described their sound production. From these references, we conducted 2 additional data collection efforts. The first one, again led by Kayla, collected additional information on their sound production, like reported frequency measurements and behavioral contexts for that sound production. The second was led by a wonderful undergraduate intern, Ravada, who asked several questions related to government involvement in bioacoustics research and the ability of passive acoustics to provide fisheries-relevant information. We unfortunately chose to only include references written in English in these additional data collection efforts because of the text-based nature of many of our data categories, as you'll see in a moment. We also only focused on the peer-reviewed literature for the fisheries applications data to focus in on academia's viewpoints on the subject. So with our methods now summarized, let's look at some of the preliminary results of what we found. And we'll start with the data describing where we're at currently. So there were 96 known soniferous fish species in Canada, representing 29 families shown with the boxes, with the most known species and rockfishes, salmons, sculpins, cods, shads, and tunas, with many others also represented. While species associated with saltwater were more common, there were also some that inhabited freshwater and brackish environments. Most of these species were fished both commercially and recreationally in Canada. Kayla couldn't capture Indigenous and test fisheries data as comprehensively, but at least some species from those fisheries types were also represented. And these species make active sounds for reproduction, aggression, disturbance, or other behaviors like schooling or competitive feeding. And it turns out there were many government agencies that were either an affiliation of study authors or supported fish acoustics research. Most of these agencies had clear fisheries management or conservation aims across national, tribal, provincial, or state, and local governmental bodies. Some of these agencies had less direct ties to fisheries and marine management, but generally served to fund fundamental and applied research more broadly. Finally, there were a couple that maybe were a bit more unrelated to today's talk topic, but are still fun as they point to other uses of fish sounds in studying the evolution of communication in the case of NIH, and military interests in bioacoustics with ONR. Overall, there were 60 peer-reviewed English references that listened to or recorded our soniferous fish species, of which 51 had some amount of government support or involvement. So there are a lot of actively soniferous species that are fished in Canada, whose sounds have been studied across a fairly extensive body of literature and with widespread government support and involvement. Despite this, to our knowledge, there are still not really any Canadian fish species that are regularly monitored using their sounds. And that brings me to our aspirational state. What could passive acoustics be useful for based on what's been published in the peer-reviewed literature? And one way we approached this was to see what passive acoustic monitoring applications related to a particular species sound production had been proposed by study authors. Of the publications we looked at, 33 mentioned some kind of fisheries management applications for 24 species sound production. To visualize what authors said about these species and applications, we collected relevant references from the abstract, introduction, and discussion of these papers to make a word cloud of the most common words found in these descriptions. And the bigger the word, the more common it was in our sentences. So let's break this down. Some of these words were based on how we identified the sentence as relevant, like mentions of sounds, management, and passive acoustic monitoring. But you may have noticed the most common word in these descriptions was spawning, and the ability of passive acoustics to find, monitor, and quantify spawning aggregations and activities were among the most common applications mentioned. This is because many of the species studied produce distinctive and frequent sounds during reproduction. This went along with a more general interest in figuring out where individuals were and what they were doing. There were also some mentions of the impacts anthropogenic noise pollution could have on these fisheries species and their acoustic communication that could also be relevant for management. Gatted species like cod and haddock were more commonly discussed in terms of their passive acoustic applications, but there were several other species like herring, sturgeon, and trout, as well as both marine and freshwater environments mentioned. Finally, there were many different ways authors used to describe the utility of passive acoustic monitoring, but often this was in terms of its potential or possible applications rather than demonstrated utility for fisheries management. So to try to quantify these applications a bit more explicitly, we made determinations on whether 5 different types of general fisheries relevant information were gained within our study's recording efforts based on both number of species and number of references. So let's walk through each of these with examples. First, the most common based on species was gaining distribution information on where fish were and when, including even estimates of abundance. This is perhaps the most straightforward passive acoustics application, where if you detect a species sound production in an area, then you can say the species is in that area. This has been done, for example, with freshwater drum, which was considered an invasive species in this study, but they are also a popular recreational fishery species in Canada. Rodney and Francis were able to map where drum calls were recorded across their study area, with recordings as short as 3 minutes needed to identify drum call presence. While straightforward and potentially incredibly effective, there are still some challenges with passive acoustics in mapping distributions. So first is that it can be incredibly difficult to estimate detection distance of a sound, especially in shallow water. So you may only be able to say that the fish species is in the area, but not what that area is. Second is that this can only say whether a species is present, but the absence of a sound doesn't necessarily mean the absence of a species. Additionally, many fish sounds may not be easily identified to species, or at least requires in-depth knowledge of species sound production abilities, as well as other sounds found in the area to be able to identify them confidently. It can also be similarly difficult to distinguish between individuals, making abundance estimates more challenging, again, depending on the species. So the next most common application by species and the most common by number of references was information about reproduction. The relevance of this is beautifully visualized here for haddock, which produce distinct sounds at different stages of courtship and spawning behavior. Sounds like this can be used to identify where and when fish are engaging in reproductive behaviors and perhaps even reproduction rates and success. Though these applications can be constrained by some of the same challenges as monitoring for distributions. Because of how fish sounds are often used in reproductive behaviors, these sounds could also provide information on the growth or sex of the fish, if, for example, only sexually mature older male fish are able to produce sounds. They can sometimes, additionally, even when younger and older or male and female fish can all produce sounds, they can still be differentiated based on their acoustic characteristics. Finally, while not as common, there were a few studies and species whose sounds provided some amount of information on trophic ecology related topics, like when fish were eating or being eaten. While more speculatory than some of the other examples, there were some discussions of this in terms of air movement sounds produced by species like herring. As these bubble clouds shown in the echogram and their associated sounds can be released by herring schools in the presence of predators, there was some speculation in the literature that these sounds could be monitored to gain information on predation and predator avoidance activities. There was a similar example with catfish that sometimes produce stridulation sounds when grasped by a predator. And other fishes also produce distinctive sounds while competitive feeding that could be detected and may be useful as well. These applications, however, haven't been as fleshed out in the literature, especially as they relate to fisheries, and so it's less clear at this point how useful they would actually be. Now, related to these air movement sounds, I do also want to take a moment to talk about passive or incidental sounds. All the data I've discussed so far was centered on active sounds and actively soniferous fishes, as they have been more well studied, but there are some potential applications for passive or incidental sounds to provide fisheries relevant information that I wanted to mention as well. In the case of herring or other air movement sound producing fishes like salmons, their behaviors likely produce a mix of intentional and incidental sounds as part of this process, and so both could possibly be used to provide information. There's a similar example in Arctic char, which also produce air passage sounds, shown on the top three visualizations, as well as distinctive gravel movement sounds shown on the bottom from females creating nesting areas. As many fish species do similar nest building or red cutting behaviors, such gravel movement or digging sounds could also possibly be used to help with identifying reproduction activities and areas. So those were overviews of all of the different applications and uses discussed, but what does this look like in terms of species? And I'm going to present this as a rough gradient based on my own impressions of what we currently know. The first species, Atlantic cod, is pretty much ready for passive acoustic monitoring right now. Their sounds have been well described, they've been used to delineate spawning areas and timing, and there's even an automated grunt detector that's been developed to facilitate recording processing. There have also been several extensive passive acoustic deployments to monitor their sounds in the US that could serve as examples for Canada. Other gadids like haddock, Arctic cod, and walleye pollock are close behind, with ongoing efforts to operationalize their passive acoustic monitoring. There's then a wide grouping of fish species that includes salmons, herrings, sunfishes, sturgeons, American eels, rockfishes, and others that seem to produce species-specific or at least genus-specific sounds that might be able to provide at least some information on their distributions, reproduction, and other behaviors if their passive acoustic monitoring were validated a little further. Next, there are some species like tunas and catfishes that have been shown to produce sounds, even in multiple studies, but their sounds may not be distinct or common enough to be as useful for fisheries monitoring. In the case of tunas, for example, as highly mobile pelagic species, and with one study estimating a maximum detection range of only 9.4 meters in quiet ocean conditions, they might be incredibly difficult to detect with any regularity. There are also many other species like largemouth bass that haven't been found to produce sound yet, or just may not produce sound at all. New soniferous fish species are being discovered every year, and as a result, you can never definitively say a species does not make sound. But in terms of passive acoustic monitoring, we would at least need to gather a lot more information on these species for them to be useful for passive acoustics. So to summarize, the aspirational state of passive acoustic monitoring looks really promising in Canada. encompassing a variety of species and applications, but there's likely a lot more work needed for more widespread implementation. And that leads me to the steps to bridge our gap between our current state and aspirational state. And for this, I'm going to zoom out from just Canada, and I'll discuss this in terms of broader needs, as well as what we at FishSounds are doing to try to help bridge this gap. And this will likely come as no surprise to anyone, but really a lot more research is needed to facilitate passive acoustic monitoring for fishes. This was discussed beautifully by Ashley Lillis in her FishSounds Educate seminar earlier this year. But to reiterate some of her points again, only about 4% of fish species have been studied for their sound production globally. And as we've seen for our Canada fish species, even ones that have been studied may still not have enough information about their sounds to be used for passive acoustics. So really, any additional information would be helpful. Luckily, there are ways to help facilitate research efforts, such as with partnerships with local aquariums or fish farms to get access to species for auditioning. There's new technology like portable audio-video arrays to pinpoint sound-producing species. And there's a lot of existing hydrophone deployments, such as from the Ocean Networks Canada's live listening stations, that could be used to get a wider swath of recordings. For our part, and as an example of what such research efforts could look like, we're excited to be working with a wonderful PhD student, Sarah Robertson, supervised by Charlie Martin, who is looking to facilitate passive acoustic monitoring of Alabama fish species. She'll be determining the current state of knowledge of soniferous fish species in Alabama waters, and then conducting species auditioning, field deployments, and outreach activities in order to fill in any gaps of knowledge, test the feasibility of passive acoustics with different types of equipment and habitats shown with the circles and boxes, and to just generally raise public awareness of fish sounds in the region. We believe this framework could be easily translatable to other regions and would be eager to collaborate if this would be of interest. But while such studies are great, there can be a lot of fish sounds knowledge that just never gets published. There also isn't as much public involvement in recording fish sounds as bird sounds, for example, where it's really helped elevate their quality of research. And for this, we're excited to be collaborating with another past seminar series speaker, Jack Greenhalgh, who is leading the compilation of unpublished freshwater recordings so that they can be described and eventually published where they might not have been able to on their own. You can find more information and directions on how to contribute to this effort at the FishSounds website. And it would be great to see a similar effort for any fish sounds, not just those from freshwater, and to just generally tap more into the enthusiasm of naturalists, aquarists, and other enthusiasts to help improve our knowledge of fish sounds globally. But with all this amazing research, it's important to get that information in the hands of fisheries managers and policymakers. This is not a new problem and certainly not unique to fish acoustics, as this research practice gap has been long discussed in the literature with different approaches proposed to help improve these linkages. These recommendations usually suggest the use of co-production or using communication, adaptation, and adjustment through regular engagement with stakeholders to drive both the research and its use for management. In fact, Isla and Kieran touched on very similar frameworks related to conservation and outreach in their FishSounds Educate seminars. Such processes, however, are challenged, especially in bioacoustics, as these different stages can require funding and time to do so effectively, and many fish sound studies are still done opportunistically. The Gulf toadfish data I mentioned at the beginning is actually one such example of this, where I had incredibly limited resources and funding, and so I studied the sounds that were most available and framed my research around them, rather than having the space and funding to conduct a research project that might have been of higher management priority. So recognizing these challenges and not wanting to discourage such opportunistic research, I still think awareness of the research practice gap and taking co-production approaches would be helpful to consider when feasible. And we're trying to further contribute to help bridge this communication gap with fish sounds when we can. In fact, that was part of the hope with our seminar series and today's talk especially, to help demystify and inspire future work to facilitate passive acoustic monitoring of fisheries species. We're also working to put more fisheries data on the FishSounds website to make it more accessible for managers and practitioners. We put a preliminary version of the fisheries focused data discussed today on the FishSounds Fisheries project page. So anyone interested can access the list of soniferous fished species in Canada, their sound production information, potential applications, and associated references. Once our fisheries data is finalized, it will be integrated more fully into our website functions later this year. In the meantime, we've also added a fisheries species only button to allow folks to filter to Canadian fisheries species in their searches. And we hope this is something that could be done for other regions or globally as well. And continuing the spirit of bridging that gap, I wanted to end with a quick overview of resources, recorders, and analysis tools in case you are interested in applying passive acoustic monitoring to your research or management interests. So step one would be figuring out if your species of interest is known to make sounds. And in the case of fishes, I of course recommend checking out fishsounds.net. If you click on our search tab and click on fish species, then you can search by species, family, region, or other information and find reports of sound production studies. Like we talked about though, just because a species makes sound doesn't necessarily mean it would be a good candidate for your monitoring applications. So I always recommend checking the literature cited for more information if you can. And of course, just because a species doesn't have a published report of sound production doesn't mean it doesn't make sound either. If you're interested in more intensive fish sounds data searching and filtering, you can download spreadsheets of all of our data at our repository on Borealis. If you would like more details about how our data was compiled, you can find this described across several publications. And of course, you can always reach out to us if you ever have any questions. Now, once you have hopefully found your target species using fish sounds, you need a way to record them. And there are a number of topics to consider when you're choosing a recorder, a few of which I'll cover here. First is attended versus unattended recorders. With attended recorders like dip recorders, the entire unit might not be able to submerge fully in water, so these are more common to deploy from shore or a boat. While this limits the amount of time or situations that could be spent recording, they are often cheaper and could still be used to cover a wide spatial area like that Gulf toadfish study I mentioned at the beginning. Unattended or autonomous recorders can be deployed fully submerged, often for longer periods of time, in some cases over a year or continuously, and therefore could be deployed in a wider variety of situations, though they're generally more stationary as a result. Next, there's calibration. Calibrating a recorder can be quite costly, but allows for the accurate measuring of sound levels or volume and allows you to make comparisons between recording systems. Uncalibrated recorders may still be sufficient for fisheries applications though, as they can be still used for event detection, like identifying the presence of a fish sound in a particular area. Other considerations would be battery life, memory storage, frequency range and sensitivity, as well as the durability of your recording equipment. Though this can be a lot to parse through when you're starting out, but luckily I've found that companies that sell recorders will often be incredibly helpful in trying to match your application with the proper equipment. There are also a number of initiatives to make underwater recorders cheaper, like with hydromoths or the work of a task team from the IQOE. And there may be student discounts or country-based discounts available depending on the company. And something like a GoPro may even be enough to get you started as more readily available uncalibrated option. In summary, you have a lot of options and those options are getting better and better every year, but just make sure your equipment is going to fit your needs and don't be afraid to ask if you're unsure. So once you have your recordings, what can you do with all your data? Well, similar to the recording equipment, there are so many options and they're getting better every year. So I'll just highlight a few here. Usually step one after collecting recordings is to both visualize and listen to them. And for this, I recommend Raven out of Cornell University. These images depict bird sounds, but you can get similarly helpful visualizations for underwater sounds. The Raven Pro version has the added benefits of being able to annotate and measure the acoustic characteristics of individual sounds, as well as to develop automated detectors with machine learning to facilitate the processing of the often hundreds of hours of recordings generated with passive acoustics. If you're interested in looking at longer term, broader soundscape trends, then I recommend checking out Manta, which offers a MATLAB or standalone plugin to calculate sound pressure levels and generate visualizations in a standardized, comparable way. And then there's an exciting new tool called the Fish Sound Finder that allows for the automatic detection of low frequency fish grunt or knock sounds that are common to many fishes, including some of the species we talked about today. Now, all of these options have wonderful tutorials and manuals to walk you through their use. Beyond these more user-friendly applications, many folks use custom code in MATLAB or Python for more complicated acoustic processing. And while our Fish Sound Seminar Series is coming to a close, there are many other resources for learning about bioacoustics, again, a few of which I'll highlight here. For example, Discovery of Sound in the Sea at docits.org offers a really helpful introductory modules on a variety of acoustics topics, including the science of sound and fish sound production. The Wild Labs community provides a forum and resource hub for everything conservation and technology, including bioacoustics. And actually, just this week, they released a new online course feature that included an introduction to bioacoustics, which covers a lot of the topics I touched on in these past couple of slides, but in a lot more detail. The Bioacoustic Stack Exchange is another example where it offers a forum to ask questions to a community of bioacoustics experts, like how to conduct a particular analysis or troubleshoot equipment issues. And there are also a growing number of workshops and summer schools to introduce participants to bioacoustics topics. So these are just a few that I found very helpful, especially when starting out. But at this point, I encourage anyone listening to share others they know of in the chat. And so with this, I hope my talk and this seminar series more broadly has helped inspire you to explore underwater sounds and their many applications, as well as to give you some initial direction to help get you started. With that, I want to acknowledge all of the people and institutions who have been involved in this research, this seminar series, and Fish Sounds more broadly. I'm especially grateful to Fisheries and Oceans Canada for being interested in funding both our education and Canadian fisheries work, as well as the Banting Postdoctoral Fellowship for funding me. And I'd be happy to take any questions now, or you can always reach out to me online. Thank you. Amazing. Yeah, Sarah already sent, we do have a list of additional resources on the Fish Sounds website. Some of these are on the link that Sarah just sent, and we also have some other educational resources on the Fish Sounds Educate project page as well. So a lot of options there. So any questions? Ooh, I see another one. Michael Stalker sending a link to a sound library at OCR.
I have a question, Audrey.
Sure.
What aspect of marine bioacoustics, and maybe we could just focus on fish sounds, are you most excited about in the future?
I think for me, it's like a really exciting time to be in the field, and I'm so grateful that I get to participate in it just because of the rate of discovery and tool development and interest that I've just seen in the, few years that I've been working in this field. And I think a lot of that tool development will make passive acoustic, especially underwater passive acoustics, a lot more accessible to make recorders a lot cheaper than they used to be traditionally, and to also have a lot more user-friendly tools to process recordings. Because I had a lot of trouble figuring out how to work in this field when I was starting out and locating resources, but that's certainly getting easier and easier every year.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that.
Thanks. Elia?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I think it's also really great to see all the resources that you put together. I kind of had two small questions. One was, I know you briefly mentioned and I'm not going to be able to pull the correct words out. It was like one of the tools, kind of, I guess, like the acoustic recorders that you could use. That was maybe kind of like a baited underwater system or similar to that. I can't remember what exactly you said, and I'd love to know a little bit more, or if you could share the resource on that. My second question was, um, I was wondering if you did most of the analysis by hand, or if you used any of the like automatic detectors, and then if those detectors do take into account like different regions, or is it kind of right now just generalized?
Mhm. Amazing questions. So the first is I specifically highlighted this portable audio video array that was developed by Xavier Mouy. And I just pulled up the DOI link to the article so you can check it out. But basically, he and his team developed different styles of audio video arrays that could be deployed in the field so that you could look at the videos and also pinpoint where the sound was coming from so that even if you had multiple fish in view, you could more confidently say, this is actually the species that was producing this sound. There's a lot of challenges in figuring out what fish species make sound, and there's been a lot of errors or like misidentifications in the literature. And so something like this is meant to help do that in a field setting where again there might be a lot of fish species in the area. And so he used it for different rockfish species and identifying their sounds, but it's meant to be something that other people could put together and use as well. And Xavier is amazing and always eager to help. And so I would recommend checking that out for you or anyone else listening. For the tools that I mentioned, for my part, for my Gulf toadfish sounds, for example, I didn't have so many recordings that I could kind of choose between how intense it would be to develop a detector or to just process them manually. And my recordings were also incredibly messy. There was a lot of drift algae banging into my hydrophone, for example. And so I just ended up processing it manually, where I just scored whether I heard or saw a toadfish call every 15 seconds, for example. But certainly the automated detectors are getting better and more user friendly every year. And with those, some of them, like the fish sound finder, are meant to be generalized. Again, that was developed by Xavier Mouy and other folks, so that they could, do generalized grunt and knock detection since they're so common. And it was mostly trialed in only a couple of locations, but now I think other people have used it in other regions and it seems to perform fairly well. But other ones like there's like clustering tools where you don't need to put in any information, where it can just sort sounds by categories for you. And then you can go in and identify them that way. And so another more generalized tool. But there's other ones being developed where you build a very specific detector for your specific sound, and it's meant to perform that way as well. And so the example for that is the Arctic cod grunt detector was built for Arctic cod grunts, though I believe, Kelsey and others are trying to see how well it would pair with other like polar cod grunts and things like that to see how applicable they are. So a very long answer, I apologize, but there's a lot of different options for tools basically to check out.
Thank you so much. That was a very helpful information.
Amazing.
Very, very interesting. I am excited to see where those detectors can kind of go and how that evolves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and learning more from the terrestrial realm as well, where some of this tool development is taking place. Like one I didn't mention is Arbimon, that offers unsupervised clustering, or even like you can give it a single reference recording and it'll try to find that sound. But they've mostly been applied to terrestrial recordings so far, and so we're excited to see how well it'll work underwater. Things like that too. Yeah. Thanks, and Brittany sent the link in the chat room. Yeah. So I see a question in the chat. Can this knowledge be applied to other species like insects? What would be the main difference in equipment? So sort of, I transitioned that beautifully in that a lot of these tools are actually developed for terrestrial environments first, a lot of the time. And we certainly have a lot of knowledge transfer between the realms, though it can get a little bit siloed at different times. But bioacoustics can be incredibly effective for certain taxa and may even be the more dominant tool for monitoring species, especially in the case of frogs or birds, where they're really hard to find in dense forest environments, but a lot of them make quite loud, very distinctive sounds. And the same is true for insects, though I think with insects, for example, they struggle with the same challenges as invertebrate sounds, where there's such a wide diversity of invertebrates and the sounds can be so species specific that it can require a lot more ground truthing to cover even just a few species. But yeah, a lot of the recorders are different. There is the need to waterproof things or use a hydrophone instead of a microphone. It is very like a very different piece of equipment and how it detects and records sound. But a lot of times the tool development sort of builds off of each other, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Amazing. So with that, we'll call it a little early. I want to thank everyone for attending. I really appreciate all of the questions and the discussions that we've had across this entire seminar series. And I encourage you all, if you're interested in learning more, to check out the talks of our past seminar speakers. You can find them at the Fish Sounds YouTube channel. I just sent the link in the chat. And as I said, you can always feel free to reach out to Fish Sounds or me or anyone else on the team. We're really eager to see this field move forward and would be happy to help facilitate that as you work through all of your projects. Yeah, with some fish emojis from Brittany. So thank you all so much. And yeah, I hope to hear from you soon. Bye, everyone.